A new poll revealed a sharp decline in support of ISIS among young Arab men and women between the ages of 18 and 24. U.S.-based polling firm interviewed 3,500 teens and adults in 16 countries between January and February of this year. So they found that 78% would not support if ISIS were even less violent. 13% still said they would, which is definitely a decrease from 19% of last year. They also found that half of the respondents found that, ISIS is the #1 problem facing the Middle East, and also 36% believe that unemployment is the main factor for ISIS in recruitment, as opposed to, religious superiority or anything else. So we're seeing, the youth kind of making these claims, as opposed to thinking that ISIS and their propagandic ways are recruiting the youth. Instead, they're actually revolting against this by realizing more and more each year about the brutality of ISIS.
Yeah, and, looking on that graph that we just pulled up, I wish I would have seen, lack of democracy or lack of Arab unity higher up there. But at the same time, I think this shows a good trend. And, as ISIS, as they grew in the beginning for the first few years, right, we were learning a lot about ISIS. But now, more than ever, we have more information, and we're even here, we're talking a lot about the details of the way that they operate, the terrible things that they do.
Yeah.
I think as that information spreads, you're going to see a decline, because I think something that you'd find is if you go from country to country, you might see a variation of how ISIS is portrayed in the media, how it's portrayed by a lot of people. So as information comes out to a lot of people and they really find out who ISIS really is, I think we're going to see a sharp decline. And I think that's a really good thing to say here. Another thing, this very same poll also came out with some numbers regarding the Arab Spring.
Right.
And some could in a lot of ways contribute the ails of the Arab Spring to the rise of ISIS indirectly, because we saw a lot of people going out, leaders being deposed. Look at Libya, for example. Of course, the U.S. played a role in that as well. But people going out of the streets, getting rid of these dictators, and then leaving this void, basically filling that void with a government that couldn't really keep a handle on everything that's going on.
Right.
And that gave rise to groups like ISIS, for example. They would take over that vacuum. So if there was democracy there in the first place, we wouldn't have seen this problem. But that's just another issue. And for me, what's important to realize is, though, talking about the Arab Spring, is that there was, if you go back to 2011, 92% of people in countries where we saw uprisings were talking about how the one thing that they would want the most is democracy. 92% of people said that is their #1 goal. That's the one thing they want to see. That number has dropped so far down, and it's sad to see that just you fast forward a few years later, and it's just plummeted, that number. Because look at a country like Syria, right? They were out in the streets asking for democracy, and now what do you have? You have instability, you have civil war, a lot of different factions fighting each other. So in some countries it worked. I mean, a country like Tunisia, it may have worked. In others, like Syria, definitely didn't work.
I mean, specifically now, only 36% feel that way, that they'd rather have stability over democracy. This is since 2011, 2012.
All they're asking for is for stability. What a basic thing that we take for granted, right?
And another thing, too, is that 47% believes that the relations between the Sunnis and Shiites have completely worsened, which kind of shows that, okay, is this the youth kind of promoting for more of a, secular state for the Middle East to finally let go of any religious, ties to that. So that also is something interesting to note for the youth.
And we see, the way that history works, it's not always linear. It's not always straight up or straight down. Like, are we becoming more secular? Are we becoming less religious? It's hard to say. I think overall, if you look at the West, for example, you could certainly say yes. Even for a lot of countries in the Middle East, yes. But at the same time, you look at a country like Iran, for example, which went from being very liberal to all of a sudden, you see an Islamic revolution, and then it just goes down the opposite direction. So things can go up and down. So I can't just say that, we're on this upward trend. But in general, we are. But there's always going to be these up and downs in between.
Oh, no, of course. But at least steps like this and notes like this is definitely some sort of progress. There is a quote from Hassan Hassan. He's a fellow for the Middle East policy in D.C. What he says is, the solution to Daesh must not be limited to military and security responses. The organization thrives on political, economic, social, and religious failures. Daesh may weaken and disappear, but the underlying sickness will remain, and similar groups will emerge if that sickness is not addressed. So, all in all, it's a high unemployment rate right now in the Middle East. So even if ISIS, or other words, Daesh, were to completely be destroyed, the underlying economic problems that are, facing this country, who's to say another militant group will not rise because of it? I mean, they're kind of feeding off of the weakness of that.
Of course. And it's no coincidence, right? When we trace back the origins to, let's say, of the Paris attackers, for example, a lot of them come from, marginalized parts or suburbs of Brussels. In Belgium, Molenbeek, for example, a very poor area, a high concentration of unemployment, and of course, these people are who feel marginalized, who feel disenfranchised. Of course, they're going to be the ones who kind of feel a connection with a group like ISIS that says, oh, your own people aren't taking you, and your own fellow Belgians don't care about you. Look at the way they treat you. They look at you like you're some, terrible Arab person. Come join us, right? So that's the issue. And terrorism, wars, it's all byproducts of inequality and economic struggling. And I know that's, I'm just giving this broad blanket statement, but that's something that's going to take very long to overcome. And, until we deal with that, we're going to also have to deal with terrorism, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it was also just interesting that religion came second. All this, it wasn't the main reason of why they were recruited, because you would think that they were kind of distorting Islam, and they're recruiting people because of that faith. But mostly, it's like you said, it's the economic troubles. Also, I kind of want to point out too that the United States, the number of ISIS fighters in Syria and Iraq are at its lowest level in 2 years. The U.S. government said on Tuesday. So, all these reports, they're kind of showing signs of a weakened ISIS, but we don't know yet. At least we're getting these reports, and we'll have to just wait and find out.